to be bigger, better, and bolder than ever before.
We are not going back. Welcome to the Trump Trials Sidebar from the Washington Post. I'm Libby Casey, and I'm here in the studio with James Hohmann and JM Rieger, columnist and senior video journalist. And we are so fortunate to be joined by our friend and colleague, Joseph Ferguson, who is in Chicago. I'll talk more about Joseph and all of his many skills and talents in a moment. But first, what a week. It's 100 days, less than 100 days until the election, the presidential election, but also, of course, all these offices in Congress, the Senate, around the country, governors' races. And just when you thought your mind could not be blown, Donald Trump has done it again, telling a room of Black journalists that Kamala Harris, who will soon officially be the nominee for the Democrats, happened to turn Black. We'll talk more about that in just a moment. Other things we're going to talk about in this week's episode, J.D. Vance's rocky rollout on the vice presidential campaign trail, and just what good and use is a vice president anyway? We'll talk more about that. Let's dive into all of it. And I want to start with our friend and colleague, Joseph, our very own Washington Post TikTok star, who is part of a team along with Dave Jorgensen and Carmela Boynton, creating content for the Washington Post universe. And you can follow them on TikTok, Instagram, and on YouTube. You can also listen to us on YouTube. You can watch our show if you're not already, and you can listen to us, Sidebar, on your favorite podcast app. So, Joseph, you are at the NABJ convention this week, the annual gathering of the National Association of Black Journalists. It is always the place to be, but every year it's dynamic, it's interesting. But this week, it has not just made news in journalism circles, it has made news all over the country. And you were in the building on Wednesday when 3 journalists interviewed presidential candidate Donald Trump on stage, and it was a thing. Let's listen.
Some of your own supporters, including Republicans on Capitol Hill, have labeled Vice President Kamala Harris, who is the first Black and Asian American woman to serve as vice president and be on a major party ticket, as a DEI hire. Is that acceptable language to you? And will you tell those Republicans and those supporters to stop it?
How do you define DEI? Go ahead. How do you define
diversity, equity, inclusion?
Okay, yeah, go ahead. Is that what your definition?
That is
give me a
literally
definition
the words
then. Would you give me a definition
DEI.
of that? Give me a definition of that.
Sir, I'm asking you a question,
No,
a
you
very
have to
direct
define
question.
it. Define it for me, if you would.
I just defined it, sir. Do you believe that Vice President Kamala Harris is only on the ticket because she is a Black woman?
Well, I can say no. I think it's maybe a little bit different. So I've known her a long time indirectly, not directly very much, and she was always of Indian heritage, and she was only promoting Indian heritage. I didn't know she was Black until a number of years ago when she happened to turn Black, and now she wants to be known as Black. So I don't know, is she Indian or is she Black?
She has always
but
identified as a Black woman. She went to a historically Black college.
I respect either one, but she obviously doesn't, because she was Indian all the way, and then all of a sudden she made a turn, and she became a Black person.
Just to be clear, sir, do you believe that she is...
I think somebody should look into that, too, when you continue in a very hostile, nasty tone.
It's a direct question, sir. Do you believe that Vice President Kamala Harris is a DEI hire, as some Republicans have said?
I really don't know. I mean, I really don't know. Could be.
That's Donald Trump at the NABJ convention being interviewed by ABC correspondent Rachel Scott. She was one of 3 interviewers talking to the presidential candidate. Joseph, with so many reactions, so many thoughts, but let's start with this. Where were you when this interview was taking place?
So I was actually in the lobby of the ballroom because it was standing room only. You could not get in there. I think he spoke. He was slated to speak at noon, so the line was starting to form at around 11 o'clock, 10:30. So by the time I landed and got in there, there was absolutely no room for me. So I was in the lobby watching the live stream.
So there was a live stream. Was it someplace central that you all could see it, or were you all watching it on your phones?
So they had some places set up throughout the conference where you could watch the live stream, but I was there kind of like watching it on mute almost because I could hear it, I couldn't see it. So I could kind of like pair the words with the sounds I was hearing in real time.
What was the reaction among the journalists and conference goers when Donald Trump said that, when he questioned Kamala Harris's Blackness?
See, I think the reaction was a little twofold. I think one, people were like shocked that he would say something like that, and also as a journalism group, we aspire to get answers to hard questions. So I think that people were proud that we could ask that question to him and get some semblance of an answer. So while the answer might have been, very surprising and shocking, I think that NABJ as an organization is proud that we got to ask him those hard questions.
What's the conversation been like there in Chicago about the interview since then? Because this was a huge newsmaker. I mean, Donald Trump is not often questioned by journalists with challenging, interesting, dynamic questions. So how have people been talking about it, Joseph?
Yeah, I think it was a fascinating turn of events. Every 4 years since NABJ has started, they invite both candidates to speak at the conference. Hillary Clinton has been there. Joe Biden appeared virtually in 2020. So the first two times Trump ran, he turned down the invitation. So he came this time, and it was a very it was a very interesting atmosphere because, like I said, we are journalists and we're there to ask hard questions. And also, him being there added a very tense air to everything, where people weren't sure what he was going to say. People weren't sure the benefit of having him there. So there were definitely some competing schools of thought at NABJ when he was invited and then when he actually was there to speak.
Yeah, I mean, how unusual is it for Trump to get tough questions?
In 2015 and 2016, it was a lot more common. Yesterday sort of felt like a flashback to the 2016 campaign. Back then, he would go on Chris Matthews on Hardball, and that's where he would say stuff like, yeah, the woman should be punished for getting an abortion, because he wasn't well-versed in policy or politics. And he came into the Washington Post for a sit down with the editorial board in 2015. That was a lot like what you saw yesterday. But lately, this election cycle, he has not done those kinds of interviews. He hasn't felt the need to. And it's rare for him to venture outside of, he spends a lot of time attacking Fox News for not being supportive enough and criticizing Fox and its corporate ownership. So I think this was strategic. He knew what he was doing. I think we will discuss and dissect it, but he was trying to create this moment. He made what I see as very offensive remarks very early. It was clear he was going to be asked that. It felt like he was sort of teed up to go. And I don't think he was playing to the audience in the room. I think he was playing to an audience watching at home. And we can talk about what he was trying to do. But I think this was part of a strategy to pivot the campaign from a week of praise for Kamala Harris to trying to make it from kind of a future-oriented campaign to making it about otherness and identity. And Trump feels very comfortable with his base fighting over those issues. It felt very similar in that sense, too, to 2015 and 2016 and before, where he was talking about Barack Hussein Obama and demanding to see the birth certificate. So I think it has created more of a backlash than maybe he and his team expected. But I think Trump knew exactly what he was doing. It clearly was a strategy. The rally a few hours later, they put up on the screen a Business Insider story that said Kamala Harris is the first Indian vice president. He mentioned it again. So I think this is this was more strategic than it seemed for people just kind of tuning in.
It does seem a very specific othering strategy by Trump. We talked about this during the convention, the way they talked about migrants in a very kind of othering them over there tone. That was what came across yesterday when he was talking about Harris and how she, quote unquote, happened to turn black. He also has done that a couple times this week. He said Schumer was a member of Hamas last night at his rally. Earlier this week, he seemed to agree with a radio host who called Doug Emhoff, quote, a crappy Jew, right? So and he's also using Palestinian is sort of a pejorative term as a negative, right? He referred in that same comment about Schumer about how Schumer's become a Palestinian, right? Which he said before, and he echoed again last night. It feels like a very sort of us against them strategy, them over there, they're trying to change the country. And I do think this is, we've talked over and over again about how they think, Trump thinks it's a base election. That's playing into that.
Importantly, too, when he first got there, when he was asked the question, the first thing he said was, Kamala's not here, I'm here. I've been the best president for Black people since Abraham Lincoln. So I think that while he is trying to other her with the people outside of that room, there's also some sort of convincing with the people inside of the room that he's the best candidate for them. And I thought that was a very interesting way to start it, because he knew, because it was made public that Kamala wasn't there for scheduling reasons because she was attending a funeral. And there's tentatively something planned with NABJ later in the campaign season. So I thought that was a very interesting play to start the interview with, and then also to say that she's not Black.
Yeah, I mean, he often has this line, and I almost wonder if he believes it, where he says he's the best president for Black Americans, right? Like, this is something that and then he has like this, often like a largely white audience that's like, yes, yes, affirming it. But this was delivering that line to a room of mostly Black journalists and people who are there because they're passionate or interested in Black journalism, and, you know, figuring out how Black journalists, so I'm going down a weird road here. But this is a chance. But this is a moment where Trump is talking to a room of Black journalists, so it's a very different audience than at a rally. Joseph, okay. So there's a couple different things here. One is just how Trump's presence was received, and then a separate thing is those comments where he's questioning Harris's Black identity. So let's just dig a little bit into who Kamala Harris is. I mean, we even heard Rachel Scott say at one point there, she is a graduate of an HBCU. She's a graduate of Howard University right here in Washington, D.C. Can you talk about how people in that room perceive Harris's Blackness, Joseph?
Yeah, I think that Harris obviously graduated from an HBCU. She's also a member of a historically Black sorority, the AKAs. And I think that people in that room and very, very much view her as one of their own. Black people are no stranger to people being biracial. And I think that one identity does not invalidate the other one. I think that we understand that she can hold these two identities and identify with them equally. So I think that when she calls herself a Black woman, it's understood that she identifies as a Black woman, and her history shows that. So it's an interesting line of attack that I think Trump is using to go further to call her a fraud in general, to say that she'll change her positions on Medicare for all, she'll change her positions on immigration, she'll even change her positions on race. So I think he's trying to use that as a jumping off point to say that she's a fraud politician.
James.
Exactly. That was the point. That's such a good point. I think that's exactly what he's trying to do, which is if she won't tell the truth about her race, then how can we count on her to tell the truth about these other things? And I think he really hopes, and again, this is speculation and it's putting yourself into someone else's head, that Harris overreacts. And, you know,
and she's not.
And she's not. She handled it, I think, very Zen-like, you know, saying it's divisive. It's what we've come to expect. But I think what Trump wants is
he's trying to bait.
The other side, and then to be like, see, these people are constantly accusing me and you of being racists. And, you know, this is what you're going to get if Harris becomes president. I think that is how he sees the strategy. I think even his top aides are sort of horrified by this. This is not how they would choose to prosecute the case against Harris. But this is Donald Trump. This is who he is.
So, yeah, JM, talk about how other Republicans are reacting to this, and how is J.D. Vance talking about identity on the campaign trail and what he hopes is his boss's take on Kamala Harris's racial identity.
I think what's so interesting about this additionally is that House Republicans last week in a closed-door meeting, leadership was saying, do not use race and sex in your attacks on Harris. Keep it on policy, keep it on what you think she's going to do, what she says she's going to do. And
J.D. Vance has been sent down to the border, right? That's what they want the focus to be on.
Right. And Vance last night was talking about this, and to what Joseph was just saying, said Harris is a phony. He called her a phony, talked about how she's using, in his words, an accent wherever she goes. She went down to Georgia earlier this week and she was using an accent, in Vance's words, and she was from Canada and whatnot, right? Again, this othering, this talking about how she's a fraud, how she's a phony. But it is interesting how Trump and Vance in some ways here seem in a totally different lane than where I think congressional Republicans want to be right now with how they're talking about this and how they're also just trying to pull the momentum back to their side, right? We've seen a really stark shift here where Republicans seem to have a lot of momentum coming out of the convention, and now there's a lot of enthusiasm on the Democratic side, and Republicans trying to reframe that conversation. And, you know, I guess we'll see whether Trump or Vance accomplish that here.
So tell us about the audience that was there. People seemed attentive, interested, curious in the conversation. There were some audible gasps at moments, especially when he was talking about Kamala Harris and questioning her identity. Did Trump have fans in the audience, Joseph?
Yeah, Trump actually brought at least two Black supporters to come in to the convention just for the day and sit in the front row. And if you listen back, you can hear laughter with him, you can hear cheering with him, and those are going to be the supporters he and the campaign specifically put in the front row to kind of plus one or retweet anything he was saying on that stage.
So what's the rest of the week like for you at the conference?
You know, I think after that, so I think the news broke that he was going to be there a few days prior to the conference, and that was kind of looming over everything until it actually happened. So now I think people are kind of still in a daze, like, oh my gosh, that actually happened. And I think now we can kind of get back to like NABJ business as usual. There are going to be workshops here. There's a job convention for anyone looking to be an employed journalist, and networking opportunities abound. So we're kind of getting back to NABJ's usual, but there is still that lingering, wow, that actually happened feeling in the air.
Well, we'll let you get back to all the cool stuff you're going to be doing. We're all relieved also, Joseph, that this is a hotel room you're talking to us from, because otherwise it's the most Spartan existence. You live like a monk. I'm glad this is not where you actually live. So.
No. I don't fear worldly objects.
All right,
not where I live.
Well, check out Joseph as part of the Washington Post universe. You can find his content on TikTok, on Instagram, on YouTube, and he's part of our 3-person team who makes really accessible, joyful, and also informative content. So many thanks and props. Thanks, Joseph. Talk to you soon.
Thank you for having me.
Have fun.
Bye.
So something else I wanted to talk about, and I love that, like, doink,
I know,
he's really
I love
gone.
that too.
Yeah. Something else I want to talk about, though, that happened there at Trump's interview was he talked about January 6th, and he was asked about pardoning the January 6th rioters and people who broke into the Capitol. So let's listen to that exchange.
When Time Magazine asked you if you would consider pardoning all the rioters, you said, yes, absolutely. Sure. You called them patriots. 140 police officers were assaulted that day. Their injuries included broken bones, at least one officer lost an eye, one had 2 cracked ribs, 2 smashed spinal discs, another had a stroke. Were the people who assaulted those 140 officers, including those I just mentioned, patriots who deserve pardons?
Well, let me bring it back to modern day. Like about 5 days ago, we had an attack on the Capitol. They viciously attacked our government. They fought with police. They fought with them much more openly than I saw on January 6th. What's going to happen to those people? What's going to happen to the people in Portland that destroyed that city?
But sir, my question is on those.
What's going to happen to
my
the people
question is
that
on
tried
those
to bring
rioters who assaulted
Excuse
officers.
Me. You have to
would you pardon
what's
those
going to
people?
happen? Oh, absolutely, I would.
You
if
would
they're
pardon
innocent,
those?
If they're innocent, I would pardon them.
They've been convicted.
And by the way, the Supreme Court just well, they were convicted by a very tough system.
But sir, we're talking about people that were seen beating officers with flagpoles, dragging them down the stairs. They're on video. Have you seen that video, sir?
Oh, really? Well,
you would pardon those rioters?
They shot a young lady in the face who was protesting. They shot her in the face. You know, nobody died that day. You do know that.
That's Donald Trump speaking at the National Association of Black Journalists Convention, being interviewed by ABC correspondent Rachel Scott. She was one of 3 journalists on stage asking the former president and candidate questions, we got some insight there.
Yeah.
One, that he would pardon them, something he said before. Let's also do some fact checking, James.
People did die, 7, I believe, in total, including law enforcement and supporters of the former president who were trying to stop the certification of an election. And it was very different than the protests last week when the Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu spoke to a joint session of Congress, which is what the former president was referring to. The people who did assault officers last week were arrested and charged. Big picture, this tells us Donald Trump hasn't changed. After the horrific assassination attempt, there was this sense that it was existential for him, that he was rethinking things, that he was going to be different, that he encouraged that. And
That he encouraged that thinking.
That thinking.
Like, this
He
is
encouraged,
not, yeah.
that he's going to be different. And you know, this is the guy who was running for the last 2 years, promising to be revenge and retribution. And it's clear that from that he has not changed, and it is it does foreshadow what a second Trump term would be like.
Yeah, the use of language is so interesting, JM. You know, he talks about the modern moment, like last week, and that almost makes January 6th like super far off in the distance, like something that happened really long ago. And of course, it's not long ago. It's a very present part of our reality. There are criminal cases ongoing for some of the rioters and attackers of the Capitol building. Donald Trump himself is still under investigation, and there's a pending court case potentially related to his involvement in the episodes leading up to that. And then also this idea that Ashley Babbitt, the woman who was killed by a police officer, was a peaceful protester is not true. She was shot while she was trying to break into the speaker's gallery. And that has been looked into, and there's been a reckoning over that. But he's turning her into a martyr, and he's turning the people who were arrested into martyrs.
There's an effort to kind of brush over the events of that day, right? And James referenced the 7 people who died. That's according to a bipartisan Senate report. The people who died either that day or in the days that followed that the Senate report found was directly attributable to the events that day. And this is, he's talked publicly about how this campaign's about retribution. He's talked in very dark terms at times about the state of the country, and it gives us a window into how he views things, his worldview on things. And the way that he talks about January 6th illustrates that picture for us. And the fact that he has never, he is still sort of doubling down on this notion that it was a mostly peaceful protest, that people were there for protesting a legitimate, in his eyes, right, stolen election. It is simultaneously remarkable and not remarkable. I think to James's point about how he actually hasn't changed that much, and he's sort of playing the greatest hits at his rallies, right? He goes on those talking points all the time. And, you know, I think that just from a political analysis standpoint, whether this specific comment factors into the election or not, we'll see. But broadly, this is not the lane where Trump's campaign wants him. He is better. Polls show us he's better when he's looking into the future. Voters don't want to hear about his gripes about the 2020 election, and January 6th factors into that. So
JM is thinking like a strategist.
Right.
But so the base enjoys Trump's like red meat, the stuff he talks about, the greatest hits, as you put it. But if you're like someone who wants to be told, what can you do for me and my family? What can you do on the economy? I'm concerned about immigration. I have questions about inflation. This is not what a strategist would say to be talking about.
Well, and most people think January 6th was a terrible day, right? So the fact that he is sort of acting as if it wasn't, right, or acting as if people were, you know, trapped into convictions or overcharged on things or whatnot, and that stuff is being litigated out, by the way. You know, again, it's simultaneously surprising and not surprising.
So where does this go from here? Like, what's the strategy moving forward? Because you all have talked about how Donald Trump's trying to portray Kamala Harris as the other, trying to create divisions. He does seem to be struggling a little bit to find a lane in which to critique her in an effective way. And he has people telling him what to do, right? Go after her on the border, go after her on Biden's track record. But he doesn't seem to be able to do that, James.
His ads they are up on TV. I watched his rally in Harrisburg, Pennsylvania on Wednesday night after the NABJ event. And it was funny. He said, my people have polled 25 different hits on Harris and told me which are the best. But I'm going to keep talking about the ones I want to talk about. And he said, Trump himself said the best hits are border and inflation. And then kind of was going through and rattling off some of the others. The campaign wants to define her as a San Francisco liberal. I think it has been incredibly frustrating for Trump because he is so used to having the spotlight on him and being the center of the political universe that for the last 10 days until the NABJ event, he wasn't. Kamala Harris was. And I think he was really annoyed about how the negative attention that J.D. Vance got, and so I think this feels like a desperate cry for attention to bring the spotlight back to him, which just hitting Kamala Harris on immigration and inflation wouldn't do. And I think he sort of wants to shake things up because he feels like the momentum has gone her way. And that is how he thinks.
So is any attention good attention?
His view is it is. I don't think it is.
I mean, if you read like a child rearing book, right. Toddlers often want attention and will do destructive, negative things to get their parents' attention. But we parents have been told not to.
Well, that's what, what I mentioned.
That negative reinforcement because it is fulfilling, right?
And it is. And we're going to, and that's, I mean, in some ways it feels, I hate to use this word because what Trump said was offensive and we should be talking about it, but it does feel like in his head, he's like laying a trap by trying to make this about race and identity and DEI and instead of about the future. And that's where I think Democrats have done a good job with this weird branding because it's sort of like, like Trump is focused on like this weird retrograde, backward looking America where there aren't more than 30 million multiracial people in the country. And that's a better way to frame it, I think. But it does feel like
I want to pause you there.
Yeah,
so weird branding, this is like weird trademark. It's like weird,
TM.
Little TM, like capital W weird, because this is a tack that Democrats are taking. They are calling Donald Trump and J.D. Vance weird.
And I think it's better than sort of just playing into their hands, and because it does feel like Trump wants everything to be about Trump and does sort of respond to. He is like a child. I mean, I mentioned that it's like 2015, 2016 all over again. The thing is, Trump ended up winning that election.
Right.
So there were how many hundreds of times in 2015 and 2016 did we have something like happened yesterday and say like, oh my gosh, it's over? Like who, the Trump's not the. Regular
the public
people
is upset by this, right? But on the other hand, he won the election.
But it kept his coalition, including many new voters, together. And so with Trump, you do, to channel our colleague Rhonda Colvin, who's off this week. You never know, anything could happen. And with Trump, things you would assume would end up like destroying any conventional politician like this. Trump ends up doubling down and ends up mudding the waters enough. And so you can't ever say with Trump, like, oh, I mean, he is like Teflon. He has Teflon. He's coated in Teflon.
He trusts his political instincts, frankly, above any advisor, right? And he thinks that he won in 2016 when a lot of folks were telling him he had no chance, right? So in his mind, he won in 2020, right? He thinks he won in 2020. So he actually thinks he's won 2 elections, and he thinks he knows. He trusts his instincts more. And I think that's part of what's coming through here, right? So, yeah, the weird stuff is very interesting just because we'll see how much that continues here or doesn't.
All right. Well, speaking of Donald Trump's instincts, we're going to talk next about his pick for Vice President, J.D. Vance, and whether or not J.D. has had, well, kind of a weird week. So stay with us. You're listening to the Trump Trials Sidebar from the Washington Post. As we talked about last week, J.D. Vance's rollout on the campaign trail as Trump's vice presidential pick has been rocky. But this week, the focus has shifted entirely to his comments on women, cats, women, families,
Women with cats.
and without children. So our colleague JM compiled a mashup of some of the comments that J.D. Vance has said over the years about people who don't have families. And I want to share it because that comment that J.D. Vance has gotten a lot of attention for, criticizing Democrats as childless cat ladies with miserable lives. And he specifically shouted out AOC, Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, Pete Buttigieg, and Kamala Harris. It wasn't a one-off. There was a pattern of this. So we're going to roll this tape. Comments from 2020 and 2021 of J.D. Vance in his own words.
We're effectively run in this country by a bunch of childless cat ladies.
The fact that so many people, especially in America's leadership class, just don't have that in their lives, you know, I worry that it makes people more sociopathic.
If you're making $100,000, $400,000 a year, and you've got 3 kids, you should pay a different, lower tax rate than if you're making the same amount of money and you don't have any kids. I think we have to go to war against the anti-child ideology that exists in our country. I understand some people don't have kids. There are health reasons. There are other reasons people don't have kids. But the entire Democrat Party is like this childless cabal. When you go to the polls in this country as a parent, you should have more power. You should have more of an ability to speak your voice in our democratic republic than people who don't have kids. If you want to experiment on somebody's kids, Kamala Harris, AOC, and so forth, have your own kids.
J.D. Vance in his own words, clips from 2020 and 2021 put together by JM Rieger. JM, I'm sorry, but the JD JM, like I'm gonna call you JD at some point.
And there's no periods anymore.
That's right. JD took the periods out of his name. Did you see that, James?
I did.
Yeah. JD, no J period, D period.
Correct.
All right. So where to begin on that? Sociopaths, people who should get taxed at higher rates. And
I mean, quick fact check: Kamala Harris does have 2 stepdaughters that just, you know, I think they're stepkids. So yeah, one boy, one girl. Yeah. Thank you. And her husband's ex-wife put out a statement saying that Kamala has been a great co-parent for the last decade. So, and Vance himself has said, "Oh,
that's like if you have the endorsement of your partner's ex, that's gold stars there in the parenting category." Yeah, and Pete Buttigieg has children and has talked about how difficult that journey was to get children and to become a father, and how painful it can be when you don't have kids if you want children.
Right.
But he's not just doubled down on this, JM. This has been a recurring theme in his sort of philosophy of American governing.
Yeah, he tried to, when the initial Tucker Carlson, the miserable cat lady clip that has been kind of seen around the world at this point came out, he tried to sort of brush that aside as a one-off situation. So we wanted to dive into the archives a bit here, and we found at least 12 examples of him talking about childless adults and criticizing them and talking about them in negative terms and how in sort of implying that they're hurting the country, right? And obviously that was at a time before Buttigieg had children and now since has kids. But I think what is especially interesting there is we know that this rollout has not gone as planned for the Trump campaign with Vance. And the real risk for the campaign with stuff like this that is being resurfaced is it's almost reinforcing the baked in negatives on Trump that some folks have memory hold a little bit. This brings some of that back up to the surface, I think. And the other thing is the Trump campaign has, and Trump himself has struggled with women voters especially. That cost them, at least in part, in the 2022 midterms. This is not the sort of stuff you want out there if you're trying to bring people into the fold to win what's expected to be a tight election. So I think that there's a lot of risk here and for Trump campaign and for Vance, and this is kind of the defining period, right? A lot of people didn't know who Vance was when Trump picked him. So if this is the sort of stuff that's out there so close to the election, that's a risk for them.
It shows that Donald Trump gets away with things that Vance and others can't. This is that classic, like the Trump transference. Like Trump can say and do crazy and outrageous things and everyone just sort of accepts it. But even when his own running mate is doing it, it doesn't really work. The doubling down, the way Trump doubles down when he's under fire, it doesn't work. And part of the problem is Vance was only elected to the Senate in November 2022. He's only been in the Senate a year and a half. And it is very different being an author and hosting a podcast than being a senator and a politician. And I think that it is one of those things where, he was he was a candidate at that point, but he was running for Senate. And you're trying to be
trying to go right.
and he was trying to get Tucker
he had to get
support.
he had to win a primary, so he had to get voters on the right. He wanted to woo Tucker Carlson, which he was successful at doing, and that has paid off because he's on the Republican ticket in large part because he made friends successfully with Tucker Carlson and Don Jr. But now those comments have a life, right? They have a shelf life. And J, no period, M, no period. We'll find the clips, right? He'll roll the tape. I guess the question is, like, what does the campaign do at this point? Because there's so much talk about how you have to define yourself if you're new to the American public, or you will get defined by the opposition. And how much control now does the Trump team have to define J.D. Vance and what he brings to the ticket?
I think that they're going to try and put him out there more to counter this, right? So I think we should expect to see that in the coming...
Like some ads with cats and dogs and single people? Like what's
just puppies and kittens, just like dog pile, right? Mm-hmm. Yeah. He'll try and push back about it. I mean, there's a chance that this sort of there's going to be some big political stories this month, right? We're waiting on Kamala Harris to select her vice presidential running mate. The Democratic convention's later this month. So there's some things that are going to kind of surface where this potentially...
Sure, but this is that thing of defining, like
right.
Getting that visual
It's like J.D.
impression.
Vance is the guy.
Right, right.
And the real risk is not that Vance really helps. You're either voting for Trump or you're not voting for Trump because of Trump. I think Vance...
that sounds like something that Donald Trump himself said, JM.
Yes. Funny this week, actually.
At NABJ.
At NABJ.
It was overshadowed by the other stuff.
Yeah.
Trump was like, the VP doesn't make a difference when he was being...
we have that tape.
We have the tape.
Peter,
Amazing.
Peter, who's like our control room guru. Peter and Billy, can we roll the tape?
Historically, the vice president, in terms of the election, does not have any impact. Mm-hmm. I mean, virtually no impact. You have 2 or 3 days where there's a lot of commotion as to who, like you're having it on the Democrat side, who it's going to be. Historically, the choice of a vice president makes no difference. You're voting for the president, and you can have a vice president who's outstanding in every way, and I think JD is. I think that all of them would have been, but you're not voting that way. You're voting for the president. You're voting for me. If you like me, I'm going to win. If you don't like me, I'm not going to win.
That's Donald Trump speaking at the National Association of Black Journalists Convention, interviewed there. Rachel Scott was the one sitting right next to him in that clip. There were 2 other journalists there on stage with them as well.
So, yeah, I think it was also in that same exchange, Trump said you'd have to ask JD to talk about what he meant by this comment, which is a very funny thing to say. And he said, he's very pro-family. I think that's what he was talking about, how he's pro-family. But he'll have to explain it. He'll have to explain it. And that is, it's a remarkable thing to be sort of distancing yourself that way from your running mate.
Well, also, like, if you're supposed to really use your running mate as part of your A-team, right? So for him to be like, it's really about me, is trying to diminish the importance of J.D. Vance, which, ouch, but also it's distancing, right? It shows that Trump is aware that J.D. Vance is not having a very good week.
Yes, that was exactly. I think he knows that this is potentially bad for him, potentially weighs down his ticket. I actually don't think he's entirely wrong in what he's saying there, but to your point, Libby, the real risk is that the negative weighs down. That's really when we've seen, especially recently, where vice presidential candidates maybe bring the ticket down a little with some negatives, thinking about a Sarah Palin in 2008, for example. That, I think, is the bigger risk for Trump here if this continues to become a theme of different old Vance clips coming up, because to James's point, which I think is 100% agree with, which is only Trump can really be Trump, right? It doesn't really work for other Republicans to go out and try and either be on equal footing with him or to out Trump. It just doesn't work. And that was Vance. It worked to win the primary, but
back in 2022.
Back in 2022. But he underperformed all the other Republicans statewide running that year in Ohio. So even in the general election, Vance didn't perform well.
Is there actual question? Like, are Republicans actually questioning whether or not Vance was the right choice for the
Definitely.
ticket?
Yes.
That you're hearing?
Yes. And some, like I think Kevin Cramer, the Republican senator from North Dakota, yesterday said it's not too late to replace Vance on the ticket. I don't think that's going to happen. But
that's not something you want being said out loud.
Exactly. If you're saying, if a senator, if a colleague, if a colleague is saying that, a Senate colleague, not a good sign. And so I there's definitely a lot of, because J.D. Vance represents a repudiation of Republican orthodoxy on things like trade and foreign policy, there are a lot of hawks in the GOP who support U.S. funding for Ukraine, for example. So they're already inclined not to like J.D. Vance. So I think that there are Republicans who are sort of like happy to watch.
Little I told you so happening here.
Yeah.
So how important is a VP pick as we all watch to see who Kamala Harris chooses to be her running mate? So we're recording this on Thursday afternoon. We do not yet know who she will name, although the campaign has said that they will be out on the road together next week. So we know it will be within days. And we know that there's essentially a short list. We've been talking about that. We mentioned some of those contenders last week in Sidebar. How important is it that she picks someone who, let's start with the basics, that she's compatible with, that she can actually hit the campaign trail with and govern with?
Well, I think this is going to be a close election. The polls have tightened up. This is clearly going to be a jump ball race. It's going to stay close to the end. And I do think it's fair to think of the VP as sort of like special teams, that it's like a 1 point to 3 point kind of difference, that a good VP can help on the margins, especially in swing states.
So you're really thinking about it as an election decision,
not a governing
less
decision.
than a governing decision.
And I think she'll be thinking of it primarily as an election decision too. She wants someone who passes a governing threshold, of credibility, but that also is a political threshold too of plausibility. Barack Obama picked Joe Biden in 2008 because he brought something to the ticket that Obama didn't have, which was a foreign policy experience and a kind of a length of time in Washington. One of the problems with J.D. Vance is Trump, as Libby first said when we were broadcasting the RNC, that J.D. Vance was a mini-me, and I think that's absolutely what it is. And he picked someone who wasn't going to really bring in new voters. So I think Harris is thinking about additive, who's someone that will be a governing partner that's not threatening to her, that wouldn't run against her in 2028 if she loses and wants to run again, but also someone who has a record of appealing to people in red areas. And that's why if I had to guess, my guess would be that it's either going to end up being Kentucky Governor Andy Beshear or Minnesota Governor Tim Walz, because I think those are the two. I could be totally wrong. We'll know this time next week. But I think Tim Walz represented a traditionally Republican district in southern Minnesota before he became governor, and Andy Beshear just got reelected in a state that Trump won by 15 points. And so I think that's sort of how she's thinking. She doesn't want to do anything that's going to potentially hurt her, as we've seen with J.D. Vance, which is why I don't think it will be Josh Shapiro in Pennsylvania, the governor there, because picking him would upset certain elements of the party, including people who are unhappy with Israel's prosecution of the war.
Even though he's been critical of
Netanyahu, I think it would risk riveting the coalition. And Mark Kelly similarly, and Josh Shapiro is also disliked by the teachers unions, which are incredibly strong because of his support for vouchers and school choice. Mark Kelly's tried to get on the right side of the unions, but I think it's one of those things where Mark Kelly's great on paper, but he's not as good in practice. So we'll see what happens.
Right now what's happening is all of these people whose names have been floated publicly in circles of influence are going out and really giving their all to Kamala Harris and the race for the White House. And it's almost like drag out the decision as long as you can, because you've got this A-team of people who is just out there really firing up people, whether it's on conservative television or talk shows or in interviews on paper. I want to play a clip of Pete Buttigieg, someone who you didn't mention, who you don't think is on the short list, but transportation secretary, known by many as Mayor Pete. This is a clip from him on The Daily Show, and I want us to listen to it because what he's doing is he's both like pro-Kamala, pro-Democrats should be in the White House, but also pushing back specifically at Trump and J.D. Vance.
He said people who don't have children, this is a quote, have no physical commitment to the future of this country.
Oh. Wow.
And I just think about how, like, no physical commitment to the future of this country. Like, when I was deployed to Afghanistan, I didn't have kids back then.
Right.
But I will tell you, especially when there was a rocket attack going on, my commitment to this country felt pretty physical.
You know, just a little rocket attack. It's like, so that is Pete Buttigieg obviously responding to J.D. Vance's comments about people without children not being really invested in the future of America. So tell me about how you see their roles at this moment, JM. These people who are out there working on building enthusiasm for the Harris ticket.
The surrogate operation has been pretty remarkable in a sense, and it has, to your point, Libby, really carried the momentum forward for Harris. It feels like this really just stark shift right after the convention, how much momentum it felt like the Republicans had, and now how that's really turned on a dime here in a sense to the Harris side, and they've been able to maintain it. You know, I think that to James's point, whichever of these folks who we think is on the short list, but it obviously could be someone not on that list, right? We'll find out soon enough. But whichever one it is, the election is expected to be so close that while vice presidential candidates maybe don't traditionally impact that much of a ticket unless they're really bringing the candidate down, there's a chance that they could shore up support, you know, if it's a Shapiro hypothetically in a Pennsylvania, for example, which is really an absolute must-win state for Democrats, right? A Kelly in Arizona, right? Go down the list, and Walz playing to, and Bashir playing to that kind of Midwest, Buttigieg as well, that Midwest blue wall, right? They all bring different things to the ticket, but there is this kind of careful caution, conventional wisdom going on as well that we should acknowledge, right? All of these are white men that she is considering on this short list. Again, could be someone else, but this is playing into a little bit of don't go, quote unquote, too risky. Some strategists are saying, right? Don't put another woman on the ticket. Don't put a non-white person on the ticket, right? I don't know if that's
Harris has always been really cautious. I mean, it would be, in 1992, it was considered mind-blowing when Bill Clinton picked Al Gore as his running mate. Bill Clinton was the governor of Arkansas. Al Gore was a senator from Tennessee. They were both young. It was sort of considered like doubling down on this, you know, new generation, and
a new Southern generation.
A new Southern generation. And you know, it's funny to imagine Democrats carrying Arkansas and Tennessee today. Things have changed, but I mean, it would be an incredibly bold choice if Harris ended up picking someone like Gretchen Whitmer or Gina Raimondo and went all in on this, especially because of the contrast with all this stuff we were talking about with Vance.
Yeah, but James, you know, one thing that you've talked about in the past is how when Hillary Clinton was the nominee for the Democrats, the messaging of like, it's time to shatter that glass ceiling. The ads they had featuring little girls or featuring some of the language that Trump had used that was really derogatory and offensive about women just weren't like resonating with people that you were meeting in like a bar in Ohio. And that it had to be about more than just its time. Yeah. So that gets us back full circle then to this thing of like Kamala Harris has to pick who she thinks will do a good job on the trail, who will represent her politics well, and who will appeal. But not just be about sort of the look of it or like this generational change. Like the Democrats are not choosing right now to go with the line of it's time for generational change. They're doing more of a like, don't look back. Like those guys are weird. Like we're looking to the future.
Donald Trump's looking to the 1950s. We're looking to the 2030s. Like,
but not just because like it's like we're supposed to, but because that's what we want to be doing.
And how we'll make your life better. And no, totally. I mean, I think that there is, I know that the Harris team is looking carefully at the lessons of the Hillary Clinton campaign, talking to Clinton folks. I mean, there were a lot of people who were close to Harris, including her sister, who were very involved in the Clinton campaign. So it's, they've and obviously we all lived it. Harris lived it as she was a Senate candidate in 2016, the same year that Clinton was running against Trump. So I do think that there is a mindfulness of not just saying, and I mean, she's never said this and won't say it, vote for me because I'm a woman, because it's obvious that she would be the first, and you want to seem like you're focused on the voters, not on yourself and what you represent. And Trump often says, this isn't about me, it's about you, but then will talk about himself for 35 or 40 minutes. And I do think voters want someone who cares about them, and who they feel like is thinking about what's best for them, not for themselves.
And it's also interesting that Harris is using this framing, and we'll see if she continues to, of Trump wants to take us back. He wants to go to the past. We don't want to go back, right? We're hearing crowds at her rallies chant, we're not going back, right? And elections often become about kind of a central theme or two. And I am curious here in the next month or two how much this sort of sticks, because if so, it's a very successful pivot for Harris, making this into a choice, not a referendum on herself, on the Biden administration.
And I'll say, I've been struck. It's not surprising, but it is notable that Harris doesn't mention Joe Biden. In her big rally in Atlanta 2 nights ago, she didn't mention Joe Biden. Obviously, people connect her to the president, but I think the "we're not going backward" is as much about generational change as it is like reminding people of the chaos of the Trump years. It's not the democracy in peril January 6th message.
Well, a week from now, when we expect to record our next episode of Sidebar, although we stand at the ready for breaking news, we should know who Harris's VP pick is. We'll see how everyone's performing on the trail. And I do want to leave you with this. We had breaking news today, Thursday, about the release of I'm going to get emotional about this, but hostages, including journalists. And you can see there a photograph that was tweeted out by President Biden's account. You can see these folks who were being held captive in Russia heading home to freedom. You can see there Wall Street Journal reporter Evan Gershkovich at the bottom left, also journalist Alsu Kurmasheva in the bottom right in that white shirt, and former Marine Paul Whelan, who's wearing the blue fleece. I don't know if people ever thought Paul Whelan would be freed. And there's a lot of discussion, of course, about just what political choices were made, what the bargain included, and everything else. But in this moment, it's a victory for press freedom.
Yes, it feels great.
Yeah,
it's nice to see that picture.
Thank you from these journalists to all of you for listening and watching. A reminder that you can find us on YouTube. Just look for The Washington Post, and you can also listen to us on your favorite podcast app. The Trump Trials Sidebar will be back next Thursday, if not sooner. Talk to you then.